Okay, guys, thank you so much for agreeing to come all together to have this conversation. Obviously, the three of you are going to be joining us for the Breakwater Festival 2026. Almost said 2027, but that's the wrong year. And you're going to be doing several different things, but the three of you together are going to be on the Apologetics panel to talk about the positive and negatives of that industry. So originally we had Elliot Baywick going to be moderating it, but because of some traveling conflicts, he's not going to be able to join us for that session. I've still given him access to potentially coming to other events, but I don't quite know what his schedule is. So maybe he'll come and just be there to be a part of things. But yeah, it just didn't work out. So instead, I'm going to be your moderator. So that'll be fun. I'm excited to moderate the three of you. So to get you guys started for this main bulk of the call, I just want to get you guys to know each other a little bit, kind of put something on the table that you guys find interesting about the apologetics topic, and then we can kind of go from there, and that'll give me some sense of how I am going to moderate you for the actual event. So if you don't know what the estuary protocol is, we're going to do that and run through that. The first round is person, where you introduce yourself, sort of who you are, and then for this round, I'd like you to give a little bit of background of your own exposure to apologetics. And then for the second round, we all get to put something on the table to talk about. So it can be personal, something that has happened in your own life. It can be contextual, something that's happening in your environment, political, community oriented, what have you. Something intellectual, something you've been thinking about, reading. And then there's the estuarial, which is how we do these. I'm assuming no one's going to put that on the table, but you certainly can. And I think for this round, because we're kind of doing the apologetics, try to keep it in the theme of sort of the apologetics conversation. So that'll give us sort of a jumping off point to get going. And then the third round is point. So you point to someone else's topic that is not your own, that you found the most interesting. And that will sort of be the jumping off point for some open discussion. I'll keep the open discussion somewhat rein just to respect all of your times, but that's kind of how it goes. Any questions before we jump in? Okay, great. So, Nathan, why don't you start then?
All right, I get to be the first. Okay. In terms of who I'm Nathan Jacobs or Dr. Nathan Jacobs. You don't have to call me that. You can call me Nathan. And in terms of my background, I'm an artist turned scholar turned filmmaker. And so my background originally was fine arts painting and drawing. I went to art school. I was a hedonistic, drug using artist who then, thanks to a bad LSD trip, started on a pretty intensive journey into philosophy and religion. I left art school and I started just following different mentors and paths of research into both philosophy and religion. A lot of that was the history of ideas, basically just trying to understand not only what's been talked about in terms of the history of philosophy, but also where we stand in that conversation. A lot of things that are said today about, you can't do metaphysics anymore or whatever it might be. And so that led to a lot of me looking at church history, the history of scholasticism, things like that, as well as philosophy proper, and looking at things like modern philosophy. And over time, I built sort of a larger research program which really wasn't aimed at becoming a scholar. It was aimed at trying to discern truth. And rather than sort of being pulled into Christianity, I became a pretty full-throated, philosophical heretic who was an opponent of historical Christianity, or at least Christianity as I knew it, which was largely Western. So I was well trained in terms of Augustine, medieval scholasticism, post-Reformation scholasticism, and I had a pretty significant opposition to that. And so I was what would be considered a process philosopher, and had all sorts of heretical ideas that I knew full well and was happy to espouse those as heretical. My favorite book was Charles Hartshorne's Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes, which I thought was a delightful title, and the title alone made it my favorite book. Anyway, but after a while, I ended up encountering the Eastern Church Fathers in my doctoral studies, and they really upset everything that I thought about the history of ideas because They were, on the one hand, resonant with a bunch of philosophical intuitions that I had about free will, moral responsibility, about God, God-world interaction, all this sort of stuff. And yet they weren't heretics. They were actually significant figures within the history of Christianity. And I recognized that there was a notable divide between them and what I was reading in the Latin West. And so initially, that was just a draw that sucked me in because I was very curious to understand this blind spot I had in my survey of the history of ideas. And then over time, I ended up becoming persuaded of it and wanted to become Orthodox. I was a catechumen for about 7 years, and then I have been Orthodox now for 10 years. And so, in terms of my scholarship and things like that, that side of my life, I was a professor of philosophy and religion. I was normally, because I was trained in both areas, I'd be pulled into jobs and departments that would have me do both. And so my last teaching position was at University of Kentucky in the philosophy department. I was affiliated with Vanderbilt while I was here, but that was after leaving behind teaching. And so anyway, a lot of people who know my scholarship know me as a Kant scholar. I don't label myself as that, but my first book was on Immanuel Kant's philosophy. I've done another one, edited volume on him since. I did one on the Enlightenment. My last book was on Leibniz. And so a lot of people who know me think of me as a modern philosophy guy, but then people who are in the world of theology oftentimes think of me either as analytic theology guy, which is weird to me because I'm not that, but I'll be invited to speak at analytic theology events. And I guess it's just because I do a lot of philosophy and analysis and analytic stuff when I'm going through stuff, but I don't think of myself as that. What I mainly do is, again, it's kind of a history of ideas thing. I'm most interested in the philosophy of the Eastern Church Fathers. So a lot of what I publish is about their metaphysics or their ethics or things like that, really from the perspective of a guy who's a historian of ideas. More so as a philosopher who's constructively and simultaneously historically engaging them, doing odd things like putting the Cappadocians in conversation with Immanuel Kant. But that's again, that's kind of taboo within the academic world because you're supposed to either do constructive stuff over here or you're supposed to do like classical stuff over here and just analyze a text. You're not supposed to do this type of integration and conversation type stuff. But I don't really care what academia would like me to do. This is just the natural outgrowth of my journey and how I think about the history of ideas in the world. And so that's sort of the scholar part of my life. Over time, there was this odd side quest that led to film. So I worked in the world of, actually, I paid the bills when I was doing my grad work, working in the video game industry, doing character designs, CGI, 3D modeling, storyboards, cutscenes, things like that.
What were
And
some
then
games you worked on?
none that ever saw the light of day. So I did this for about a year for a company that ended up, because the CFO was embezzling funds, went under before any of my games saw the light of day. So unfortunately, I got to play the games and test them out, but they never. So I was working on one that was kind of like a Metal Gear type thing. I was working on other that sort of Mario inspired multiple world type things. And anyway, but yeah, so I worked in that area, and then because of that, I was able to demonstrate my ability to pre-visualize a scene, and it was very natural for me to world build or to do cutscenes or storyboard whatever else. And through encounters with people in the film world, they were like, "Wow, you're really good at that. Have you ever considered film?" And you fast forward, I decided to try my hand at a short story. I bootstrap an independent film. I'm doing this on the side, like the independent film I did during the summers while I was a professor. And that was the college comedy. Killing Poe was the first one I did. And then I was asked to do a documentary, and I took a small hiatus from teaching in order to do that. That documentary on the religiously unaffiliated, which I'm guessing will come up in this context. But and then after that, I was asked to consider actually, because the Metropolitan, the Antiochian Archdiocese was the one who asked me to do that because they wanted to know more about and engage this group that doesn't have a religion, the religiously unaffiliated, or the nuns, NONES. Um, and um, and they liked what I did and said, we'd like you to consider like not going back to teaching and making film. I was like, okay, you're gonna pay me for that? No, but we'll pray for you. And I was like, okay. And then I met some investors at a screening of my film who were really interested in what I was doing, and I was working on other stuff. I had no intention of doing documentary stuff, so I was working on a horror film, kind of in the spirit of the Conjuring universe. And they really liked that. I was in conversation with Lionsgate about that and been in Lionsgate Studios having conversations with that. And so these investors got behind me, and I basically decided to take the leap and leave teaching in order to do this. Now, I wasn't leaving academia. I continued to publish and speak and things like that. But I moved into film, and then I eventually got a first look deal. I got pulled in from that first look deal into House of David. COVID upset a lot of things in terms of the original plan and pathway there, but it eventually sort of stabilized in the world of working on House of David. And since then, I've still been doing independent projects. Now that I'm done with that season two on that show. Um, and then in terms of like right now, probably about a year and a half ago, I started moving into the public intellectual space at the behest of different people who had encouraged me to do so and thought that I might have a unique voice despite the plethora of podcasts out there. And so I went ahead and launched the Nathan Jacobs podcast, and I've been doing that for a year and a half. Plus, I've been doing Substack for a while, which was originally it was just people would write to me with questions, and I'd write back letters, theological letters, in response to a philosophy or theology question. And so I started publishing those. Actually, a Lutheran pastor started publishing those, and I eventually took it over. But so that's become part of the general, like now doing public intellectual stuff, Substack and the podcast, while working on these independent film projects that, are in development at the moment. So there you go. That's a bit of me. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Jared, why don't you go next?
Sure. Man, that's a tough act to follow. Man, yeah, I definitely am out of my weight class here. Uh, Hi, I'm Jared. I'm
Hi,
an idiot
Jared.
YouTuber. Um, yeah, I don't quite know where to begin this whole thing. So uh, I became a Christian at 13 and very quickly became a very passionate religious zealot. So for me, as is relevant to this conversation, I very quickly fell headlong into the charismatic world and cultivating personal relationship with the Holy Spirit, and supplementing that with deep dive into apologetics. So I was a big William Lane Craig fan, in that whole world and scene. Um, in high school, I was a chaplain, a worship leader, and a street preacher off and on for that. I spent 3 years at Fire School of Ministry, which is an ultra charismatic, sort of like the East Coast equivalent of the Reading's, what's it called? The Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, something like that. Um, it was sort of like that, except kind of more focused on revival and repentance and austere living. So did that, had a pretty meh time, and it felt like I was too spiritual for the secular kids in high school, and then I was too academic for the spiritual kids in seminary. And so then I was like, well, let me go back and get a big boy degree at Wheaton College. And so I went to Wheaton wanting to become an ancient languages major because I love reading the church fathers. Um, and very quickly realized that I did not have the brain power for anything like that. So I pivoted and studied Christian heavy metal music instead. So my senior project was an album called Ishmael, which was a three-way dialogue between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, centering around the Akedah, the episode of Abraham sacrificing his son, Isaac, if you're a Jew or a Christian, or Ishmael if you're a Muslim. And yeah, the thing that got me my degree was that 11-song metal album and the 90-page research paper explaining the lyrics. I'm still bewildered that I hoodwinked my professors into letting me do that. So that's my background. I became an atheist halfway through my time at Wheaton College. Um, I self-identify as a old school nihilist. Um, so I'm sure that'll be come up at some point during our discussions with everything. And so even though I'm a de facto nihilist, I still have a pretty sensitive, conscience, I would say. And so I'm very reluctant to talk about my nihilism uh, in any depth in an open context because I'm not trying to negatively impact individuals. I'm happy to talk about it kind of like behind closed doors and, in more academic settings where it can kind of get a little bit deeper. And I'm sure that this conference will be closer to that than it would be like a normal evangelical conference or a praise and worship fest. Um, what else? What else? What else? Yeah, probably 2.5 years ago now, I started my YouTube series, Atheist Church Audit. So I visit different cults, different churches, mosques, temples. Haven't hit a synagogue yet. It's been a minute since I've dove into that world. It's on my to-do list. And yeah, my whole thing is that I really like people, and I don't really care very much what people believe. I just want them to do well. Um, Kind of in broad strokes, that's my modus operandi. And so, yeah, I like hashing through ideas and personal psychologies in person rather than on the internet. I don't make videos responding to things that I've seen online. My personal rule of thumb at the moment, anyway, is that I only report back on things that I've experienced in person. That's been super important for my work. So yeah, all of that's there. Um, is there anything I forgot? Anything else that's like relevant for what we do, Cassidy?
No, I think that's great, Jared. I think it's very well rounded, and more can come out if we need it. We can ask follow up questions when we kind of open up a little bit more. Bethel,
100%.
why don't you go?
All right. So I became a Christian when I was 4. Uh, and so my parents had this whole kind of interesting journey that they took before I was ever born, where they sort of they did the thing where they came out of fundamentalist evangelicalism and got liturgy, became Anglican before it was cool. Um, so they were doing all that like back in the 80s or whatever. And in fact, they connected with David Bradshaw, who would be a name familiar to Dr. Jacobs, because I think he was one
Oh
of your
yeah.
profs, right?
He wasn't one of my profs, but he was at University of Kentucky. We were teaching in the same department at the same
Oh,
time.
colleague then.
So he's
Okay.
yeah, yeah. So he's a good friend.
Yeah, yeah. So that's it was cool when I made that connection. Like, oh yeah, David Bradshaw. Anyway, so they wound up becoming philosophers together, even though my mom did her PhD in Renaissance literature. She just kind of decided she was more interested in philosophy, so they've published a lot in that space. All to say that, I was just handed a lot as a kid that most kids are not handed on a silver platter. I grew up surrounded by books, kind of like this, but multiplied by, 10,000. Um, and so I just, grew up from a very early age, very, being taught to take faith very seriously, being taught to take the life of the mind very seriously, and being taught that these things weren't in conflict with each other. Um, and so that gave me a really, really good foundation from an early age, which then helped me to sort of recognize shallow thinking and recognize, a lot of different false dichotomies later, and people try to sort of pit these things against each other. Um, And then, my journey with apologetics and my family's journey with apologetics is really very complicated and interesting because, my folks came to it out of philosophy, like hardcore analytic philosophy, and they were really excited, like, yay, we get to use our skills for the kingdom and all that kind of stuff. And that went well for a while, um, until it didn't, because they started, sort of criticizing people they weren't supposed to be criticizing and arguments they weren't supposed to be criticizing. And doors just kind of began shutting, and they realized they weren't in the country club anymore. So I won't, bore everybody with that whole history. That'll probably come out later during the conference. But my mom has published a lot of books on New Testament scholarship. So it's also an area where I enjoy talking about that a lot. And even though I'm a layman, I'm not a scholar myself. I just have a very enthusiastic layman's interest in that kind of stuff. Um, so then, me personally, I always assumed I was going to do something academic with, the parents that I had. I thought, oh, I guess I'll be a philosopher too someday, right? Um, but then they were like, well, but we kind of want you to eat though. So maybe you could try something else. And so I was like, well, okay, I'm maybe, like mathematics or something. That's kind of a nice safe discipline because I loved writing and humanities stuff. That was always my first love. But I also knew that that had sort of been corrupted a lot in university context. And so I wound up doing a doctorate in mathematics because it's this very pure, apolitical discipline, right? You can just sort of immerse yourself in numbers and nobody cares if you're a conservative or whatever. It's, that's not going to affect your job hunt or that kind of thing. And so, I just kind of assumed I would ensconce myself in a college somewhere teaching. Um, but I couldn't stop writing. And I would use this pen name because I was writing about hot button issues and I was trying to sort of compartmentalize. But then my pen name became really popular for some reason. And then I started writing about this guy named Jordan Peterson, and suddenly that like went viral, and everyone I got invited to things with Justin Brierley. Before I know it, I'm talking to Douglas Murray and that kind of stuff, but still using the pen name because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Um, so then, I got out of grad school. I'm like, well, I don't really have the chops to be a math researcher, but I really love teaching. I discovered that was a passion of mine. So I taught high school for a couple of years, Christian high school. And for a minute, I thought that was going to be my path, like classical Christian school teaching. But that ended up sort of fizzling for, its own complicated reasons. And I was like, well, I guess I'm really going to have to make a go at this writing thing. But then fortunately, a lot of doors began opening in that area. Between one thing and another, I actually am able to make a living as a full-time freelance writer, which is not a thing most people are able to say. But just kind of piece it all together, and I'm able to wear a lot of different hats as a cultural writer. Um, I relate to what Jared said about just loving people. And so on my business cards and my bio and everything, I refer to myself as a Christian humanist, which is a nice conversation starter. Um, because both Christians and secular people alike tend to be confused by that phrase. Like, what is that? I don't understand. Like I taught to this, I bumped into this gay journalist who's like, but I thought humanists were really woke and stuff. And I'm like, well, I'm definitely not woke, but I am a humanist. So, let me kind of explain what that means. And I I like Francis Schaeffer's idea of stealing humanism back for Christianity because I think we sort of, it was ours to begin with, and people don't get to hijack and redefine it. This book, yeah, I get to do this because I have my own bookshelves now. Um, this book, A Canticle for Leibowitz, a very Catholic book. Even though I'm not Catholic, this book had a huge influence on me growing up. Um, and I really think it's all about Christian humanism. So I highly recommend that for anybody who hasn't picked that up yet. Um, so yeah, that's where I am now as a freelance journo, Christian public intellectual, occasional poet as well. I've written poetry here and there. Um, Hope to do more of that in the future. I did also write a screenplay at one point, but it kind of went the way of Nathan's video games. It was a kind of an ill-fated project, which I can talk more about off camera sometime. But so I've dipped my toe a little bit in that world too. I do sort of have a dream of maybe having a play or a movie get produced one day. I think most journalists nurse that in a corner of their journalist hearts. We'll see. We'll see. Maybe one day.
Cassidy, I realized that I never said anything about apologetics in my
Oh, that's okay.
introduction. So if you want me to, I can, but
No, you
otherwise,
can.
I won't
It's
bog
fine. I
things down.
mean, from what I understand, you grew up in a household where your mother was very into apologetics. It started early, and then yeah. The only thing I'd be interested in, and it might be a long-winded answer, but for you,
Me? Long-winded?
Never.
for you, do you consider yourself an apologist?
I don't. I actually don't. So, yeah, I'll try to not be long-winded. But yes, you're right. I grew up, my mom had had a crisis of faith long before I came along. And so she got deeply into apologetics. And so just as a curious kid, growing up, I mean, I was in a family where people would argue and table pound, and it was all Chicago construction workers and things like that. That was not exactly like varnish your opinion sort of environment. And so I grew up hearing people argue about politics, about religion, things like that. And so my mom was really responsible for bringing apologetics into that context. So I was exposed to a lot of that stuff. And when I raised questions as a kid, there were interesting answers provided, and it at least left me with the impression that Christianity wasn't dumb, right? Like, so I know a lot of people get the impression that Christianity is a sort of thing where questions aren't welcome, and there really is no intellectual substance to it. And I just didn't have that impression ever. So that was never really a part of me. Now, whether or not Christianity was true, whether or not the things I had been taught were right was an open question. But I had never been impressed with the idea. It was never impressed on me that questions are not welcome, or that intellectual pursuits aren't up for grabs, or even that, major. So, I mean, I was told, my mom, when she was sending me off to junior high, which was a Lutheran junior high, she was like, "Oh, they're going to tell you that the Earth was created in 6 24-hour days. That's not true. Just ignore that. And here's a book about why that's not true." And so I would just, I again, I was it was sort of, it gave me the impression that, oh, it doesn't, you can question whatever you want within this religion, like everything's up for grabs. And so that was really intellectually formative on me, just in the sense of the open-mindedness to philosophy and intellectual questions and pursuits and things like that. And I would just say that within academia, I always had an impression, and I don't know that this is always good, but it was nonetheless a cultural feature of academia, where like apologists are one thing. They're a specific breed that are going out there and doing certain things combatively, to try to stake a claim. And then philosophers are this other thing. And so I always lived in the philosopher's world and kind of had this bit of a distancing from the apologists, even though I think while there's some amount of justification to that, I think there's also something unhealthy about that. Somebody like C.S. Lewis will tend to get marginalized. Like, you can't use him as a source if you're a scholar. But I'm like, C.S. Lewis was a brilliant, brilliant scholar. Like, just because he wrote for a popular audience and identified as apologist doesn't disqualify anything that he's saying. That's ridiculous. And so I think there are negative side effects to that. But I would say that in terms of my training and what I did in conferences and culturally and publishing, I always tend to distance myself from apologists and run in pure philosophy circles. I wouldn't be so dichotomous today along those lines. But I think that that's indicative of my training. And right now, I mean, as somebody who believes these things, it's not like I'm purely neutral. Like, obviously, I believe I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian for a reason, because I think it's true. And so I'm always happy when I believe somebody has been awakened to a truth. Like, that's great. That's really exciting. But I don't tend to see what I do as apologist. One of the things that I think a lot of students I've had in the past, and a lot of people who listen to my podcast notice, is I tend to just offer my understanding of, like, here's the history of ideas. And so I'll say, like, an East-West thing, right? Here's how the doctrine develops in the West. Here's how it develops in the East. Here are the differences. And I never actually say who's right and who's wrong. Now, people obviously who know I'm Eastern Orthodox will presume that I'm, like, obviously he sides with the East. And when I would teach church history or historical theology, I'd do the same thing. And at some point, my students would realize I haven't said what I think about anything. And that's largely because I'm actually a believer that, engaging with the topics and the arguments and things like that, truth eventually just sort of rears its head. And so now maybe that is an apologetic strategy, to lay out these sorts of things. I don't know. But no, I don't tend to think of myself as an apologist.
Can I just make one interesting note? Because what you were saying about how, oh, you can't cite so and so, he's an apologist. My mom has encountered something, similar and really interesting in her New Testament scholarship, where she'll just go to cite a biblical scholar who happens to be on the conservative side of things, where she's just like, it makes sense to cite this scholar here. And then reviews are like, that scholar is an apologist, and it's like a slur,
Mhm.
like
Right.
like, and she's going, but this is so what, you know? And it's this weird, it's almost like a ritual purity thing where like not
Mhm.
only are you expected to not cite an apologist, but even somebody who's considered apologist adjacent is, you know, like is suspect, you know, like you're supposed
Mhm.
to maintain at least like 2 or 3 degrees of academic separation from certain people. I mean, like even somebody like Craig Blomberg will get
Mhm.
thrown into that bin. And I mean, he's like a legitimate scholar. Um, and I mean, when you read like Dale Allison and these kinds of skeptical writers, they just have so much contempt. And you know, any sort of an argument where you're daring to say, "Hey, I think there might actually be good reasons for thinking Jesus
Mhm.
rose from the dead" and stuff. It's like that's an apologist technique. That's just a, you know, special pleading something something. And it's just very shallow lack of engagement
Mhm.
with arguments. And so, you know, all to say that sort of thing almost tempts me to say, okay, screw it. I am an apologist. Even though, like you, I also, you know, technically the work I do, I mean, I'm a journalist. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm a culture writer. Um, but I happen to know a lot about apologetics and those kinds of areas. And so it tends to come up a lot in what I write. And I do enjoy talking about my faith and evangelizing. So I do some sort of sneaky, organic apologetics here and there. Um, but you know, it does get complicated, and certainly what I've seen about the apologetics industry and the subculture, a lot of that is very disillusioning, not favorable at all. And so I also hesitate to be seen in public with certain characters from that crowd. But there's also good people there, good work being done. So it's all to say it's this is very complicated, you
Mhm.
know.
Yeah. I'd just add one quick thing. The one is I really like the ritual purity
Yeah,
analogy. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah,
yeah, that's
and
true.
I would say that that's a weird thing about academic culture in general. Like even when I talk about East-West differences, you know, it's almost like we can just say, well, oh, that's derived from this certain Russian, you know, group, Losky and Florovsky, and therefore, and it's almost an ad hominem attack because they
It
say
is.
that. Ergo, it's false, right? And I'm like, that's really surprising given they were brilliant scholars. And I came to that conclusion through the primary sources, not through reading them, but okay. And so there are weird things like that in academia all the time. And like you, Bethel, I tend to do the same thing where I'm like, okay, I'm going to double down on this distinction then, and I'm actually going to defend it because I think it's correct, you know.
I'll even do
But the
that with
other,
or
no,
I
go
was just
ahead.
gonna say like even the word fundamentalist is another,
Oh
you know,
yeah.
slur that gets thrown out, which I
Mhm.
mean I'm not technically a fundamentalist. Like, you know, if I went down the checklist, I definitely would, you know, I wouldn't fall in that category. But I almost want to say I am just to mess with people because it's such a trigger word. You know, it's like, yes, I'm a Christian nationalist, fundamentalist, apologist. Bite me,
Mhm.
you know, like to see what happens, you know.
Yeah. Cassidy, I'll just say one more thing, and this is more of a seed for if it's useful at any point. But I'll just say, in terms of my thoughts on apologetics and cultural, like where people are at today, my work on Becoming Truly Human, the documentary, ended up shaping some of my perspective on the practical side of that and where a lot of people are at with that today. But that's probably a broader conversation. So I'll just put that out there.
It's very high on my watch list. I'll try to make
Yeah.
it a point to get to it with some popcorn before I land in London.
All right. Sounds great. Sounds great.
Well, actually, let me ask: is it a bucket of popcorn kind of movie, or should I, you know, pour a couple of shots of rum?
I don't know. I think it's good to have a drink, you know, maybe a good stiff scotch. I don't know what it is that you drink. I know that you drink, Jared, because I see you do it on the show, but what's your preferred Maker's
I'm a
Mark? Was
little
that
worried
what it
about you,
was?
Jared. To be
You were
honest, I'm worried you
sponsor
might have a problem.
This episode has been sponsored by Maker's Mark. Was that
I'm still gunning for that one.
no?
No, if anything, I'm probably going to get sponsored by an electrolyte drink eventually to
Oh,
offset my drinking.
oh,
Uh,
that's
you know,
very clever.
gotta be smart. Anything that looks like mop water, I'll slam it.
All right, great. Well, you all know me, so I won't go too deep into an introduction, but my name's Cassidy. I am a filmmaker by trade, but most days now I'm, you know, a mom. I do some independent event organizing, and you know, some YouTube stuff on the side. I did not always think I was going to work in film or entertainment. In fact, I tried to avoid it for a long time. Kind of got scared off by all the True Hollywood stories that my mother watched. Just thought, oh man, all of these things go downhill the wrong way. I don't know if I want that for my life. But I just really loved media and film and the art of it. And I just came to realize, like, even if I'm just working for some marketing company, I think I want to do that. So I kind of went down that path thinking, oh, maybe I'll make music videos. And it all kind of transformed. But I ended up going to San Francisco State University to get my film degree in cinema. And that kind of led me to sort of the filmmaking path that I was on, but it also led me to sort of this religious question path that I was on as well, because I grew up evangelical, non-denominational Protestant. Um, from two parents who I would not say grew up in very religious households, at least not traditionally religious. So so I was sort of like a second generation evangelical Protestant, and always kind of believed it, but it wasn't until I was sort of 18 where I took it more seriously. And it was sort of that point where it's like, well, I'm just going to live this out as best as I know how until it can be proven wrong to me. And so I left my little conservative Christian bubble in Arizona to go to San Francisco State University, living in Oakland, California, talking to really anybody who would talk to me about religious questions. And yeah, just learning a lot from people, just having conversations. And one thing led to another. I eventually studied abroad in Australia, got sort of introduced to new atheism, and that sort of lined around the time that Trump was becoming president. And I think those two things together started making me question narratives that we were being given, and or at least I was being given, and how much I trusted those and how much I should question those. And so from that point on, I went in this real deep dive of like, I just want to scrape everything away. I don't care what I want to believe. I just want to know what's true. So went through sort of a YouTube university of philosophy, religion, those sorts of things. Really, any book I could get from the library, anybody would talk to me, just talking to religious questions. So spent a lot of time listening to apologists from Sam Harris to William Lane Craig and everything in between. And yeah, eventually came back to Christianity. And yeah, long story short, eventually became Eastern Orthodox. And Nathan Jacobs actually was part of that a little bit, because we had had a conversation about filmmaking, and he had mentioned something about yeah, Eastern Orthodoxy and teaching the history of it and changing his students' minds. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And just realizing I didn't know anything about Eastern Orthodoxy. And then I started meeting all these Eastern Orthodox people. And next thing I know, I go to a Vesper service. And yeah, that was pretty much it. 2 to 3 years later, I was officially chrismated into the church. And so have been spending the last 7 years of my life trying to, yeah, figure out this new practice of religion that I'm in and trying to raise my girls in it. So that's me. So we'll go to the pitch round. So everybody gets a chance to put something on the table. You absolutely can pass if you don't have anything, but I think it would be good to just hear your kind of thoughts of the sense of apologetics and what is interesting to you about the topic. And then, yeah, once we hear from everybody, we can kind of point to each other and see what we think is interesting. So we'll go the same circle. So Nathan will start, go to Jared, and then Bethel.
Okay, I don't know if I have a pitch. I can tell you what's sort of on my mind when it comes to the question of apologetics, and this would relate to the seed that I planted before with regard to becoming truly human. So when I was working on that film, I did a lot of screening of religiously unaffiliated people, and I don't know, probably 60 plus candidates for the film. And then I had a producer who was screening more than that. And so that was sort of the second round of screening. I'd get like the data report basically, and then I'd come back and pick which ones I wanted to interview. And when I interviewed them, I just had basic questions that I'd ask them in terms of like, well, were you raised religious? Were both parents religious? Did you go to church regularly? Was it ever talked about at home? When did you first start to doubt your faith, et cetera, et cetera? And I'd go through those sorts of things. And anyway, it was pretty interesting to see how certain common patterns began to emerge, and there was a certain trajectory, right? There were certain obvious predictors of where, there'd be possible dissociation from religion later on, things that would be disillusioning, the sorts of questions that emerge or experiences that would destabilize people and so on. And so, in terms of that whole thing, I think that was really sort of intriguing to me on the one level of just seeing, okay, I'm seeing a certain common worldview, not 100%, but like 95% of these folks have certain common contours in the way they think and believe and so on, and certain common overlapping things in terms of their background and all the rest. And then I started looking at sociological stuff, and in the sociological data, I started finding overlap with the same sorts of things that I was looking at there. And so all of that's to say that that experience really opened my eyes in terms of wondering, like, well, what's going on here in terms of apologetics? Because I think a lot of the people, that entire project for me was prompted by it was prompted by the fact that there was this spike in religious dissociation that previously it had been only 5 to 7%. All of a sudden, it's like 12 to 15 and rising, and everybody's like, "What's going on?" And the impression that I got from a lot of people on the outside was it must just be that there's this combat going on between the new atheists and the classical apologists, and the new atheists are winning and everybody's becoming atheists. And I was like, from talking to these folks, I don't think that's actually what's happening at all. And so that started to raise for me the question of what is happening. And I have my own ideas about what's going on in terms of the shift that's happening. And I can just say, just by way of context, the broad brushstrokes of that is that I think that a lot of classical apologetics are really modernist in orientation. You look at the new atheist arguments, you can find them in David Hume. You look at the classical apologist arguments, you can find them in John Locke or Bishop Berkeley. It's like, it's very old school, modernist, sort of philosophy of religion type stuff. And I just think that a lot of the newer generation doesn't think like that. And in fact, I'm not even convinced that for them it's all thought. I think there's a lot of intuitions. I have a sense that the world is meaningful. It's not that I've, gone through some sort of analytic argument to arrive at the conclusion the world must be meaningful. It's just that I have a sense that the world is meaningful. I have a sense that there's purpose to things. Spirituality, right? A lot of people always poke fun at the, spiritual, not religious, because it's so amorphous, but it's amorphous because it's just a sort of an intuition, a sense that says, I'm a spiritual being in a spiritual world, and there's spiritual things that are happening and meaningful and so on. And so when I look at this, I see that part of what's happening is a shift away from a certain way of approaching intuiting truth to that is highly modernist, to something that is after modernity. And I think that that's really informative in terms of how to engage people in terms of religion. And so, I mean, just in general, to just say, one of the things that was intriguing to me was how many people, when I was screening them, as a rule, I'm not going to tell you what I believe. Like, they didn't even know I was going to be in the film, right? They knew there was somebody in the film who had been like an unaffiliated person who found religion. They knew that. They didn't know it was me. And so if they asked, like, what do you think? Right? It'd be like, it doesn't matter what I think. I'm just the director of this thing. And but I was perpetually interested in them and what they thought. And I was intrigued to see how many of them like were willing and open to engage just because I had no agenda. I was here to find out about them and what their experiences were and what they thought and what they felt and what the contours of their worldview were. And that was it. There was no, gotcha moment where I'm going to jump out and be an apologist or something like that. And I found that that in itself was informative in terms of where people are at with regard to these conversations. And I think also, obviously, the internet is telling us a lot of the same sorts of things. Anyway, that's a very long-winded way of saying, like, I don't know if that amounts to a certain type of topic. It's not really a proper pitch. But those sorts of shifts in the way apologetics maybe used to be done versus how people are engaging now is the area that I'd say I'm most interested in terms of apologetics.
Perfect pitch. Nathan, no problem. That's that's a perfect estuary pitch. So, Jared, uh, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I I likewise don't think that I have any sort of formal pitch. I just have a lot of kind of half-baked thoughts and ideas bubbling around in my noggin.
That
Um,
works.
yeah, I mean, I'm always curious kind of about the personal prerogatives that people feel. So, like, I don't know if I'm like, phrasing that well. Um, what mandate do Christians feel to preach the gospel, to show that they um, do they see it as compromise if they don't do it? Are they being disobedient if they don't, hold up billboards and grab a megaphone and shout to the heavens? I'm interested in like how they navigate those discussions, and then how apologetics kind of falls into that. Um, so there's that. In terms of apologetics in general, like I've seen really lousy apologetics, and some very deep and profound apologetics. I think my overarching sense is that usually I just kind of like I don't think that my thoughts about it are very deep or profound. I think it's just starting with the answer and then um, backtracking, looking for questions and evidence. Um, yeah, I know it's kind of low hanging fruit, but I think like the righteous mind was pretty influential for me and just you know um, how I interpret like belief formation in people. Um, yeah, and I don't think that humans are rational creatures. I don't think that they're um, presented with evidence and then jot out uh, line graphs and probabilities and decide, well, this is my position now. I think that we're tribalists. I think that we're superstitious. I think that we have hyperactive agency detectors. Um, and I think that at the core of it all, I think that there's a lot of people who really, really, really want it to be true. Um, and I think that that's kind of my base assumptions going into it. Um, but then as a person who doesn't really care all that much about what people believe, I think I tolerate most apologetics, so long as it's not, delving into the realm of pseudoscience, right? As long as it's not posturing, Bigfoot as the missing link, or not the missing link, or yeah, it's positing that people found Bigfoot bones instead of, Homo erectus or whatever. I don't know, but like, outside of pseudoscience like that, like I don't really have any qualms with it, I guess. So
Is this the
that was a
part
whole
where
lot
I
of
say
nothing.
sorry, I was just gonna say, is this part where I say I don't believe evolution is true, or we can fight about that later. Anyway,
I'm not the guy to debate it. I'll have to shrug my shoulders and say I'm not an expert, but
fair
I
enough, fair
defer to
enough.
them. Whether or not my philosophical reasons for deferring to the experts is valid, that would be something interesting to talk about. So,
All right, great. Thanks, Jared. Bethel, what's your pitch?
Okay, well, I'm gonna out myself as a modernist, which I know it's not in the ascendant. I think Nathan's right about that. I as a cultural apologist, it's my job to sort of discern what the vibes are, and I realize that the vibes are not with me at this point in time. Um, but I still believe in the modernist project. Um, to a degree, I don't believe in it in the sense that the new atheists um, prosecuted it, or even the way some apologists have prosecuted it. Um, but I think that there are a lot of misunderstandings about evidentialism, misunderstandings about that approach to apologetics, and I just encounter a lot of straw men. And what I would definitely like to see is a certain paradigm shift. Still, I would say within modernism, but there still needs to be a paradigm shift away from some of the ways that apologists have worked. I think the whole debate model needs to go away. And I think a lot of apologetic techniques were developed with that model in mind. So, the minimal fats argument for the resurrection, for example, like, here's 5 quick facts that most smart people agree on to prove that Jesus rose from the dead. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, boom, you're a Christian. Done. All right, let's go get dinner. That whole like model, it sort of came up in that naughties debate era where it's like, all right, you've got 10 minutes, Dr. Craig, go, and you got to state your case and you got to, always be closing, right? Glengarry Glen Ross. And I just think that sucks. That whole model it needs to die yesterday. Kill it with fire. And I think when I saw Wesley Huff on the Joe Rogan show, I thought that was a really interesting encounter. And to me, it was very long and rambly because that's what Joe does, right? He's very long and rambly. And they began getting into, onomastic congruence and all this sort of stuff, which I never would have imagined that Joe Rogan would be like, dude, pull that onomastic congruence shit up, Jamie, like, wow. But I think it worked because Wesley had time to sort of develop these ideas at length, and because it wasn't a debate where it's like, all right, you got to do your 5 quick facts. And I think that that's where an organic argument for Christianity is best developed, because I think it is a cumulative case. It needs to come together piece by piece in that way. And I also think there is a place for intuition. There is a place for, like Nathan, like you were saying, well, I just kind of sense that life is meaningful. I just sense that there's more out there and that kind of thing. And my mother's whole motto in her work is making common sense rigorous. So, you know, no, I agree with you. A lot of people aren't naturally nerdy. They're not even naturally rational necessarily. They don't naturally think in terms of, you know, probabilistic formulas and that sort of thing, which, this is my folks' academic wheelhouse, but they would never claim that this is how the normal person on the street thinks. Um, but what they do want to kind of offer is like, if you want to go up to that level and try to challenge it at that level, as academic people will try to do, um, it's like you can go all the way up. Christianity scales that way. You could take it to that, rarefied air level and duke it out at the level of Bayesian analysis or whatever. But you can also just hand it to the man on the street in simple, plain, straightforward English language that he understands. And in some ways, I think you can confirm the intuitions of the man on the street. You'd say, yeah, keep going. Like you're actually right. And, we're not going to bore you with like all the, esoteric reasons for why that intuition is true, but that intuition is in fact true. And so, I think sometimes when people get into biblical studies, they learn a lot of, they quote unquote learn a lot of things that aren't true. And it's almost worse. They almost lose their natural organic intuition and they force themselves into certain academic patterns that actually teach them bad habits of scholarship. And so a lot of stuff needs to be unlearned, deprogrammed in that sense. So anyway, that would be kind of my pitch for like, a reimagined modernist apologetic. I don't think you need to throw out the entire modernist baby. I think you just need some new bathwater, put it that
Hmm.
way.
If I could do a quick follow-up on that, Cassidy.
I'll allow it, Nathan.
Okay,
Keep it
thank you.
short.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll try. I'll try. Just one thing, quick thing I would just want to be clear about is that, in saying, and I'm not suggesting that Bethel, you heard anything different, but in saying that most people today are not modernists, there's not a value judgment about whether that's a good or a bad thing, right? So there's no actual value judgment about modernity in there. I suspect that you and I could actually have an interesting conversation about modernity and how much of a bad guy or not it is, and whether it's sort of a mistreated as I remember reading your review of Rod Dreher's book, and you were talking
Yeah,
about
I
poor
went on a little bit
Descartes
of
who
a rant about my boy
gets blamed
Descartes.
for everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
don't come
So
at my boy.
so anyway, so we could have I suspect we could have an interesting conversation about that. But I just wanted to put out there that, and also, I there is one label that it's not fundamentalist and it's not apologist, but I do label myself a metaphysician, which is something that very few academics would actually call themselves. So that is my own middle finger to the unacceptable labels, because who's a metaphysician these days? But that's what I am. What can I say? But I would just say I do wonder, Cassidy, if there are two different possible topics here, like one having to do with modernity and the root of where we're at and that sort of thing, as well as sort of the practical side of reimagining how to engage in religious conversations today, given the realities of how the culture has shifted. That's just a curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I could see that. Um, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot shared. I'm tempted to just pass and not put anything on the table myself because we've got a lot here. So let's go round two and kind of talk about do the sort of point round of, and Nathan, you sort of did it a little bit, but yeah, sort of what other topic that you really liked, and then once we kind of do that, we can talk about where these converge and what might be a jumping off point for where we start live in person. Nathan, did you have anything else to add about the pitch round?
No, I mean, I was just hearing, I was mainly hearing two topics there. And like, so I think where Jared, I mean, I suppose there's a possible third one because Jared brought up, which I think is a very interesting thing. And I think Bethel also brought up a very interesting thing that's overlaps, which is some of the things that are not oftentimes examined, but should be because they're relevant. So Jared, you brought up that that we're social animals and that you take that to be very significant, which I think Peter Berger, the sociologist, rumor of angels, would greatly agree with that. He'd disagree with whether or not that's determined. I'm not suggesting that you're saying this, but he would disagree with the idea that that's determinative for everything you believe. He just thinks that that's really important to be in tune to so that you can make choices about it and be aware of it and tune into it. And then also there's the academic habits, for example, that people learn, that was talked about. And so that's where I wonder if maybe there's a third topic, which has to do with things that are not oftentimes, this is a very vague way of framing it, but things that are not oftentimes taken into account in terms of like, it's almost like a stepping back from the apologetic method itself, or it's almost like a pre-epistemological type thing or something like that, this sort of self-awareness of what are the things that come into play in terms of how worldviews are formed and how people think that are relevant to how to be mindful of in terms of how we engage or reimagine something. I wonder if that's a third topic. The second, and then the other two that I'd mentioned, hypothetically, you could have something about modernity and whether or not it's really the boogeyman that it's made out to be. And you could hypothetically separate that from the things that were talked about in terms of where people are at today and, how to engage in conversations, given present realities. Those were sort of the three that I heard, maybe if I was to parse them,
Do you have a
but
favorite?
I like all three. Um, I mean, it's the modernity thing feels like it would be a niche conversation. I think Bethel and I would really enjoy it, and we'd get into all sorts of nerdy side quests about, scholasticism and what's actually happening in modernity and things like that.
That's
I
that's
don't know
totally
how.
fine. Like I agree with you. Like the history of ideas convo is a niche convo, but I do think there's a more relevant topic about like where does apologetics go from here? Like what's its
Mhm,
future? Um, and
mhm,
what needs to be discarded and what should be, you know, what could still be salvaged and worked with going forward.
mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. Jared, your thoughts? Anything that stuck out to you?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I think I'm a little bit worried that I might not have anything like valuable enough to contribute to a conversation with all this. I mean, I, I'm sure that's not entirely the case. Yeah, it's tricky though, right? I'm definitely not a philosopher. I have read neither Kant nor Descartes nor Nietzsche. So I want to make sure that uh, that I'm able to contribute something um, to all of this. I tend to live in a space that's that's much more boots on the ground, right? Like
Mhm,
I don't even know if I know how to define modernist, right? Modernist versus pre-modernists versus postmodernists.
Well, and
Uh,
Jared, I think that's exactly what you add. You do have
Hmm.
more of a boots on the
sure.
ground perspective.
Hmm.
And I think it will keep
So
the
I think that
conversation
that's
driven.
maybe the Yeah, so I think that that's maybe the missing link that I'm looking for is
Right.
like, I'm happy to talk about all of these because I know that I can sniff them when when they're in the room. But I don't know if I always have the right labels or everything for them. But I usually need to contextualize it on like a very pragmatic example, right?
Hmm.
I'm studying the Moonies right now. How does modernism fit into the idea of Jesus being reborn into a guy in the 1920s? Like, right? Like, how does post-modernity and apologetic thinking play into the fact that there's 20,000 African Americans in the United States right now who call a 54-year-old black man in Washington D.C. sweet daddy, right? Like, I mean, that's the kind of stuff where the rubber meets the road for me. And so I'm kind of looking for an in, um, whether that's Nathan's personal story or Bethel's personal story or um, the story of the people in their parishes. The- you know I think I'm looking for an anchor,
Yeah.
and I'm open to
If
hearing any ideas about that.
if I could just, jump in here, Jared, I think, one of the things that's, even though I obviously have a tendency because I'm a philosopher to jump into like
Mhm.
metaphysics and all this sort of stuff. Um, as I said, I'm not a sociologist. And so everything about the
Mhm.
religiously unaffiliated and my views that developed over time were based on the ground conversations with real people.
Mhm.
And so that's where I
Yeah,
suspect it would be an interesting conversation to see you're on the ground, which I suspect you have more on the ground experience than I do, right? I did a documentary and that was a small pocket of research. Obviously, I talked to college students because I was a professor and all that sort of stuff, but
sure, sure.
I suspect that sort of on the ground reality is something that we'd have plenty to discuss.
Yeah,
Okay,
and I
okay.
have I can't believe I didn't mention this in my opening, but now it's like suddenly, oh gee, yeah, I should mention this. This is relevant. So I'm also not a philosopher, even though, my parents are, and I like to talk about philosophical things. I'm a journalist. Okay, so,
Mm.
I talk to people, right? I just like I have actually an article just now coming out where I did this like in-depth profile of two different guys who became adult converts into completely different Christian traditions. Like, what one guy, him and his wife started going to church after the Charlie Kirk assassination, and they found like this very evangelical type mega church where the people were incredibly warm and welcoming and the pastors impressed them and now they've become Christians. And then I talked to this other guy who was deep in like, gay furry culture and all that kind of stuff. And now he's like a hardcore Thomistic Catholic. Okay, it's so like I'm fascinated by like all the different kinds of paths that people take. But then the main thing that I should have
There's
brought
got to
up
be a
was
pipeline there.
what was that?
Sorry, there's got to be a pipeline from furry to Catholic.
There
It's
actually is.
the pipe.
That's a whole thing, but it's beyond the scope of this talk.
Sure.
But one of the main kind of on the ground things that I'm involved with that my whole family is involved with is we run a ministry for people who have doubts about faith, and our good friend Jonathan McClatchy founded it, and it's just called Talk About Doubts. And people just write in from all kinds of like social strata. Quite a few pastors, by the way, um, have written in saying like, I'm a pastor, but I feel like I'm losing my faith. What do I do? Um, so I occasionally will sit in on these one-on-one Zoom calls. Nobody gets paid. It's like a totally, volunteer thing, and experts come in here and there to kind of help out. Um, and we just like hear all these different stories from real people about like what it is that has them on the edge of walking away from Christianity. Um, and that's just been incredibly useful to me. Um, to just sort of hear like no two stories are exactly alike, even though you can trace some common patterns. Um, and then, you know, thankfully, fortunately, a lot of times the kind of things we offer, it's sad in a way because a lot of times people will say, gosh, I'd never even heard this before. I was just like, watching YouTube or grabbing the nearest apologetics book or whatever, and I never even heard some of these arguments. And I'm like, well, we're sorry about that. But now you have, and it's really a lot of people have been helped by that. Um, but I'm that's mostly what I'm interested in is stories, individual people's stories. Um, and I try to avoid generalizations because I know how distinctive people are. Um, and so every time that I think I can like predict where somebody is going to go, like it'll just say something totally weird. I'm like, wow, I didn't think that you would go in that direction, but I guess you are kind of an individual, unique person like that. So let's just go where this conversation is actually going. Um, so um, I I love that about your channel, Jared, and I really to your point about cults, right? And like the sweet daddy thing and all that stuff. Um, Recently I've been binge watching a lot of stuff about UFO things with like the whole Disclosure Day and that sort of stuff coming out.
Mm.
It's really interesting to look at that whole movement, and a lot of that 70s stuff and that sort of thing, and what are the psychological and sociological factors at work there, and what do you do with testimony? Is this person just telling the truth? Is he making it up? Where's this all going? And okay, and then how do you apply that as you're thinking about the testimony and the Gospels, right? Um, what are the similarities and differences there? And these things are extraordinarily complicated. But I do think there are objective ways of assessing those kinds of things where in the end, I don't think it's just special pleading to say, well, I think my religion is true and your substitute religion is nuts. I think there are ways that you can break that down and parse that where it isn't just it isn't just me special pleading for my favorite religion.
Mhm, mhm.
Well, and I'll kind of talk about how I want to approach this as the moderator, because estuary at its core, whether you're doing the protocol or just kind of flowing within the spirit of that, is people first, trying to keep people's stories in mind so that you don't lose the humanity. And I think you each individually have very interesting stories of, just faith formation, but encounters with different faiths, different backgrounds, different people. I think together you have something really interesting to unpack together on what this sort of apologetics world and your own experience with it has taught you about shaping your own sense of the world and the way that you're seeing it shape others. And so, yeah, sort of this sort of stepping back from this idea of apologetics and kind of looking at the formation of how we come to ideas, I think is interesting. I think that could be a really good jumping off point that could lead us to different places. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, I do want to keep your stories at the heart, and I want to understand your experiences with these things, not just personally, but also the people that you've talked to, because you've all had different experiences talking to people from all different backgrounds about these things. You each have something to bring to the table, I think, on that form.
Sure, for sure.
So what do we think? Sort of the idea of how we formulate worldviews and where apologetics intersects in that? Does that seem like a good sort of jumping off point?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds good to me.
Okay.
It's a huge umbrella. Like I don't quite know where you start, but like in
Well,
general, it sounds cool.
what I'll probably do to start for the event is give you guys a little bit of a chance to introduce yourselves and kind of keep it brief, like 2-minute like intro.
Nathan.
So yeah, so kind of just had that prepared before.
Already?
I know, Nathan. I love your stories, but I'm like, how is it?
It's true. I also, by the way, oftentimes will apologize 10 minutes into my response for being so long-winded, which extends it further.
But yeah, we'll have like 2 minutes each of you, and then I will work on a series of questions that I think will kind of jump off. And again, I'm going to keep it kind of free flowing. So I'll have some questions in my back pockets to kind of move places. I'll have probably specific questions for each of you to try to figure out, certain topics that I might want to touch. But I will worry about the flow. Just come and be willing to bring your experiences, bring your stories, and be honest. Like, I don't want you guys to feel like you have to hold back or pretend you believe something you don't. I just want your honest opinions. And yeah, I think we'll have a good conversation engaging with those. Does that seem fine? Good? Questions, concerns?
Yeah, I mean, like one thing that might be valuable, I don't know where exactly it would fit into this whole conversation, but you know, each of us could talk about things that have caused us personally to doubt. And you know, obviously Jared now is no longer a believer. Nathan
Mhm.
came to the faith as an adult. Um, I'm sort of, you know, I'm sort of distinct in this conversation because I'm a
Mhm.
cradle Christian, you know, so um, my experiences are maybe not going to be as dramatic there, but I mean, I can point to seasons in my life, you know, moments where I was dealing with something, and I still have things that I deal with, and so um, that might be valuable for somebody. I don't know, you know, to see it like you can be a, you know, a confident Christian, but still acknowledge that this worldview framework has some anomalies. Um, and I think every worldview framework has anomalies, including Christianity, which I'm not supposed to say as a as a Christian who does apologetics, but I just think that's true. Um,
Is-
yeah, it's a point. I think that might be interesting to explore along these lines.
Okay, great. Well, any final thoughts before I close this down, stop the recording? Okay, great. Well, thanks for doing this, guys. It's given me a lot to think about, and I'm just really excited to get you guys all together. And yeah, I hope I can do well as your moderator. So,
Sure, you'll
You'll
do
do
great, Cassie.
great. You're gonna be
It's gonna
great.
be
all
great.
right, let me stop the
All
recording.
right.